Good morning, and thank you for joining me once again on some travels around the world. Before we begin, I'd like to thank those folks that gave me calls, sent me cards, expressing their appreciation for the series that I'm doing. This series should go up through about the beginning of June, so I hope you'll continue to tune in. Today we're going to leave Europe and a little bit of the United States, and we're going to go down to Australia and New Zealand. Australia is circled in the blue and New Zealand in the red. If you go down there, which I've had the privilege of doing a number of times, this is the map that they'll have on their walls in their schools or offices. It's different from the map that we're used to. Our map was drawn by a bunch of northerners, those that live above the equator. But for those that live below the equator, this is the way they see the world. Hence, we call them the down under folks. If you look at the compass on that map, you'll see the top of the map is pointing south. And that is because, from their perspective, south goes towards the poles, in the case of the South Pole, and going south for them is getting colder. Going north, it's getting warmer, going towards the equator. We're going to begin our journey down under in Australia and New Zealand. Both have images, like lots of places in the world. People think about the Outback here with a picture to the left, and the Sydney Opera House. As always, in in this country as well as New Zealand, when we go to, it's much more than the traditional images. It's a long, long way from the United States down to Australia. It can take 15 hours, 15 and a half hours to be exact, flying from Los Angeles to Sydney. Let me put it in perspective on a flight that I took a number of years ago. You can leave Baltimore at 5 p.m. and accounting for the time difference going to the West Coast, you arrive in Los Angeles around 7:30 p.m. And that would be, say, on a Friday. Your connecting flight from Los Angeles leaves about 11:15 p.m., again on Friday, and you arrive in Sydney at 7:30 a.m., not on Saturday, but on Sunday. But don't worry, your body still thinks it's about 3:30 on Saturday afternoon in Baltimore. This is an image I took off the internet. I love it because it depicts the outline of the country of Australia. All the population there in the center, little groups of people representing islands that are also part of the country of Australia. Welcome to Australia and their people. Australia began as a penal colony in 1788. Over close to 200,000 men and women were transported primarily from England to Australia. Many of them died, but many of them stayed on. And today, a number of the elite families in Australia take pride in being able to trace their family roots back to those prisoners. Australia is a relatively new country. It only became a country in 1901. Most of the residents live on the East Coast. You may be looking at this picture and saying, Well, that doesn't look like a bunch of Australians that I'm used to seeing. And that is because 1 out of every 4 residents in Australia today were not born in Australia. Since World War II, Australia has been heavily promoting immigration. Yes, a lot have come from England and Scotland and other parts of the UK, but they've also come from other places. They've come from Italy, they've come from Greece, Egypt, Asia, and yes, 100,000 people immigrated from the United States to Australia. You can hear over 200 different languages spoken in Australia. Yes, it's mostly English with an Australian accent, but it's also Italian, Greek, Cantonese, Mandarin, Arabic, and Vietnamese. This is a group of the indigenous people, collectively known as the Aborigines. They're not the newcomers. They can trace their heritage back to over 80,000 years ago. Today in Australia, there's a population of Aborigines of about 75,000. And although most reside in unpopulated areas, a number of them do reside in urban areas. If there is a stain on Australia, it has been the treatment of Aborigines. Unfortunately, if you look at lifespan, Aborigines have a 20-year shorter lifespan than white Australians. We're going to begin our journey to Australia, and we're mainly going to stay on this trip on the East Coast, but we're going to start in Sydney. You can see the famous Sydney Bridge there, the harbour, and the white speck back there, you may not be able to recognize it, is the Opera House. Every 4th of July, if you look on the news, they tend to have Sydney and their celebration because they're the first ones that tend to celebrate the New Year's. And they set off almost $1 million worth of fireworks from that bridge. To the right is Sydney's business district. Further out is the Pacific Ocean and a number of the famous beaches. This is Bondi Beach, very famous. Australia love their beaches. They have over 10,000 beaches, and the lifeguards are employed by the federal government, and there are 42,000 of them. Again, looking at the beach, if you look at the top sort of horizon, you can see downtown Sydney. More of the Sydney Opera House and a large ship that Queen Mary II that's in there. But what I want to point out is they've done something that I think is amazing. The Opera House can seat about 5,000 people. But if you look to that park just to the left of the Opera House, it's an underground parking garage, which can park up to 8,000 cars. I want to put something in perspective. If you look at this map, the obvious center line there is the equator. The two other lines at the top and the bottom are longitudinal lines, say looking at the United States, going through where we live, here in Maryland. If you look at the bottom of Australia, down to the bottom right, you notice the equivalent red line goes all the way to the bottom of Australia and just tips part of New Zealand. But if you compare, say, where Florida is to the equator and the top of Australia, Australia is much closer to the equator. Hence, the north of Australia is very warm, where the lower part, and we'll be going there in a minute, is much more temperate, like we have it here in the United States. Because the seasons are different, they have to celebrate differently. For instance, we celebrate Christmas in December. Well, they celebrate Christmas in December. But there's a big difference. December is the summer, the beginning of the summer for them. And so they celebrate Christmas on the beach. First time I went down there, it's warm, and I'm going past stores, and I'm seeing Christmas trees with snow on them in the windows of the stores. It was a little bit strange. Australians love their sport. This again is Sydney, out in the bay, and they love to sail. But they love their cricket, brought it over from the UK. They love their rugby in the center, and most of all, they love their football. It's not our football, it's their football. We call it soccer. Stores. You're going to say, well, that's Woolworths, but Woolworths usually has a red banner. Well, it turns out that Woolworths made a mistake. Well, they never copyrighted in Australia the name Woolworths. So another company picked it up. Looks identical to modern Woolworths that you see in Europe, but it's not the same company. Smells similar, but not the same. Just as we have in the United States, they have very modern shopping centers. But something we don't have in the States, but is common in Europe, and so they brought it to Australia, are these markets. Markets that sell everything from clothes to food to you name it. One of the other things that I found interesting in Australia is stores will have overhangs to protect you from the weather, particularly the sun. And so you could always get shade, and you can stand and look and do window browsing before going into the store without burning up in the sun. Walls have that. These are some of the stores that you might notice. US, McDonald's, Goodyear, Holiday Inn. Yes, Target is there. Kmart, even though they're probably going out of business, and Kohl's, and Amazon Prime is there. Food, always of interest to me. Pavlova, which is the dessert in the upper left, is both a dessert that is of interest in Australia and New Zealand. It consists of a meringue interior, an interior of meringue covered with whipped cream, and then sliced fruit on top. The picture in the top center is of a meat pie. They consume an enormous amount of meat pies. If you believe it or not, the average is that an individual will consume 270 meat pies a year. This is their fast food. The thing on the top, all the way on the right, is Vegemite. Yum yum. It is spread on bread and rolls. It is made from leftover brewer's yeast and extract of spices. What is that weird thing with the little yummies or whatever on top? Sprinkles. It's called fairy bread. Kids love it. It is white bread, has the crust sliced off, spread with margarine or butter, and then covered with sprinkles. And then to the right, the Australians and the New Zealanders love their Barbie. And going back to Christmas, this is what you would see for their Christmas dinner. We're going to head south from Sydney. Here in the United States, we'd see signs warning us about deer crossings or deer ahead. As you go down the roads in Australia, you'll hopefully see warnings about kangaroos, because they are everywhere. We see deer on our golf courses. They have kangaroos on their golf courses. The countryside going south from Sydney is very, very bucolic. Very nice area. We arrived in one of the first towns that I went to way back in 1984. It's called Melbourne. It is a very, very beautiful city with lots of parks. It's famous for its extensive parks throughout the city. But it is also a very diverse city. It has the largest Greek population of anywhere in the world outside of Greece. This is an example of some of their parks. You might notice some different vegetation than we're used to. Although the temperate, it can snow in Melbourne in the winter. This is downtown. The trolley car or tram to the left is something we don't see here in the United States. We see a lot of them in Europe, and you will see them in both Australia and New Zealand. Melbourne is very lucky to be close to the coast, and as such has a very major river that flows through town that provides entertainment and also becomes a very pretty sight looking from some of the office buildings. Thought you might want to see some of the housing. This is typical housing. That's a little bungalow up on the left and some traditional townhouses. Some of those townhouses there date back to when the country became a country. House down in the bottom left is a much larger house than you usually see. It has a little bit of European flavor with the roof tiles. They don't use the kind of tiles we have in the United States. They use tiles similar to that used in Europe. They're a clay tile. The houses to the right, well, look a little jammed in. Remember, this is the city, not out in the country. If you go a little further south of Melbourne, you will see a gorgeous coast with cliffs and these massive rocks that are surrounded by water. If you were standing on top of that cliff and you'd be looking out, which would be to the left of the picture, you would be looking south to Antarctica. There is nothing between this point and Antarctica but ocean. We move northwest of Melbourne and we come into wine country. Australia is the only country, except for France, that exports the amount of wine that it does. These are some of the vineyards. You may have tasted some Australian wines. Going further north, you probably see a terrain that's somewhat similar to those in western Maryland. But this area is a skier's paradise. It is aptly named the Snowy Mountains. This part of the world, or this part of Australia, there are more ski slopes than there are in Switzerland. To the northwest of the Snowy Mountains, there are huge ranches. Ranches that are between 4,000 to 10,000 acres. And that's where you get your Australian wool. Australia is the largest producer of wool in the world. Picture to the left, we've got a bunch of cowboys rounding up some cattle. But note that not all the cowboys are wearing a traditional hat. Many of the riders today are wearing protective helmets. And that is because so many of the riders had falls and head injuries. Picture to the right, we've seen dogs and horses herding cattle. But since the ranches are so large, they use helicopters to herd their cattle. We now go to the almost middle of Australia, actually the north, maybe a little bit north of the center of Australia, to Ayers Rock, a very popular place. It sits out in the middle of nowhere, a couple of hours airplane ride there. There are very few paved roads in the area. But it is an area that it can be very dangerous. When I last did this presentation a few days before, somebody was staying at this tent resort and they wandered off and they were never found. Down at the bottom you can see some of those unpaved roads. This is called the Outback. You've heard it. This is what it looks like. We now move back to the east coast in the northeast part of Australia to a town called Brisbane. Again, this is one of my first trips that I made down there. I've made several. I came here to teach at a military organization. While most of the other cities, particularly Sydney and Wellington, not Wellington, but Melbourne, have become very cosmopolitan with their populations, different ethnic minorities, Brisbane and this area has stayed very, very traditionally English. Very few immigrants, for whatever reason, migrate to this area. Forgot to tell you a story. Again, this is my first trip to Australia, and I taught a class for about 2 weeks. At the end of it, they were very appreciative of my efforts, and they invited me on a Friday evening to a farewell for one of their generals. It was going to be a dinner. And so I graciously accepted. I went to the dinner, and it was in this very older building. And all of the officers were there in their dress uniforms, and the wives were there dressed very, very nice, long dresses. And it was like a little social hour, cocktail hour, and we're all chatting, and I'm the token American. And all of a sudden, there's a piper comes piping out, and he comes to the center of the room, he plays a little tune, and then all of a sudden I see the women leaving. and they're going out the door, and they're going down to the officers' club to have their own little gathering. It was only going to be men at this gathering. Piper goes back behind a door. We sit there and talk for another 10-15 minutes. The piper comes back out, and he plays a little tune. The gentleman who was my escort officer said to me, "Do I know what that meant?" Well, you know, I have Scottish background. I'm sitting there racking my brain. I have no idea. I recognize the tune, but I have no idea what it meant. What he said is, that's the signal that we're going to be going in to sit down for dinner for 3 hours. And once we sit down at the table, nobody gets up. So if you have to make a potty call, now is the time to go. Everybody disappears off to the loo, which is what same thing they call it in the restrooms. They call that way in England, and they call it that way in Australia. Story does not end there. We go in and we sit down at this very long black table. There's probably about 40 officers. At the far right end is this 4-star general. I'm sitting in the middle with my colonel escort officer next to me, and I'm talking to all these Australian officers. But I look down, and there were 4 glasses in front of me for wine. And I noticed that one of them is filled. But I also noticed that there's a fly swimming around in the wine. So I'm sitting there saying, good grief, what do I do? Because I know from past experience that the first thing that'll happen at the beginning of the dinner is a toast to the Queen. So do I sit there and then take the wine and swallow the fly, or do I ask somebody to replace the wine and cause some embarrassment? So what seemed to me to be an eternity of my thinking, I finally decided. I saw a steward go by, and I tried to quickly just say to him, could I have another glass of wine? Unfortunately, everybody started apologizing, including the 4-star general coming over and apologizing. I felt so small in my chair. Went on for an absolutely wonderful evening, including passing the port around at the end of the dinner. It was a great evening all around. Right by Brisbane is an area which we could almost call their ocean city. It is called the Sun Coast. And right off the Sun Coast, or Gold Coast, is an area that we've all heard about, the Great Barrier Reef. A reef that extends 1,000 miles northward. This is an aerial picture of the reef. I will tell a story, though. When I was first flying in, I was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and the Australian that was sitting next to me was pointing out things, and he also pointed out there's not only sharks out there, but there are 3 species of poisonous snakes. I never did go swimming in Australia. We've all seen the coral. Unfortunately, due to global warming and other things that man is doing, the coral is dying. This is the symbol of Australia. Naturally, the kangaroo. The other, the bird, is an emu. Why was that chosen as being the symbol of Australia? It's because both animals cannot walk backwards. And so they symbolize that Australia only moves forward. This is Canberra. Canberra is the capital of Australia. It wasn't always the capital. Sydney was the capital at one time. And about 35 years ago, there was a big, shall we say, arguments between the folks in Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere that the capital shouldn't be in Sydney. And so a place that was out in the middle of nowhere, it's along the coast, not too far from the coast, about 30 miles, but it was basically farmland, nothing there. And they built a capital, and it's called Canberra. But it took a number of years to force various government entities to come to Canberra. And still to this day, a lot of people that work there during the week, and then they go home to Sydney on the weekend or back to Melbourne. As a consequence, when I took Carol there, we had an awful time. I'd go to meetings during the day and come out and say, let's go to dinner, trying to find a restaurant. Restaurants were open during the day, but not in the evening, because everybody leaves. This is not a large population in Australia, but this is the buildings that folks work in today. I used to visit those buildings off to the left side of the picture. This is a brown snake. It is the second most poisonous snake in the world. A little story about a brown snake. On a visit with Carol, we were invited out to one of the Australians' home for dinner. After dinner, we're sitting out on the back porch, and I noticed this brown snake crawling along a fence. And my neighbors, or the guests, my host, I should say, said, "Don't worry about that. That's our friend Nellie. She's back there every night." I did not appreciate being that close to a brown snake. Australia has the most poisonous snakes in the world. Children learn about poisonous snakes starting in kindergarten. They learn how to give first aid. They learn how to get away from them and stay away from their habitat. We're about to leave Australia, but I couldn't do it without a couple of animals. Both of them are saying adieu and hoping that you'll come back. We're now leaving Australia and going to New Zealand. Got to fess up that New Zealand, of all the countries that I've visited in the world, is my favorite country besides the United States. It is comprised of two major islands, some small islands, but two major islands. And I particularly love the South Island. New Zealand is water, farmland, and mountains. They call themselves Kiwis, and that's after a bird that lives in the northern part of the North Island. This is a kiwi bird. It does not fly. These are New Zealanders. A little bit more white Anglo-Saxons in this group, a couple of Asians, but you will also see original people, the natives. And that's because since the beginning of Australia, it has always been a country that has integrated with the native population. New Zealand was actually discovered by Polynesians in about the year 1200, and a lot of them migrated there. It wasn't until the 1800s that folks from the UK started to arrive, and it became a nation state in 1840. well before Australia. But one of the things that it did for its native people, they're called the Maori, is it guaranteed in their constitution equal rights right from the beginning. They are absolutely part of the entire community. There's no discrimination that I could detect in the country. As a matter of fact, in that Constitution, let's go back for a second, like most countries, it's a parliamentary system. You have, I believe it's 103 members of parliament in the Parliament of New Zealand. 7 of those, mandatory, have to be elected by Maori people. Doesn't mean they can't run in other districts, but a minimum of 7 are Maori. You might notice Harry and Obama there. This is a traditional Maori greeting. When you do this, they say you are as one because you are breathing and sharing the same air. This is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She is a formidable politician. New Zealand had about 1,000 people affected with the COVID virus. This week, she announced that the virus had been defeated. There are no new patients. How did they do it? She laid down the law. They stayed home for a month. Only absolutely essential services were maintained. Heat, light, power, that type of thing. And as such, they were able to eliminate the virus. And they've set up very, very strict rules on who can come into the country. And that's against them because they depend on tourist dollars. But she's also a very sweet woman. Last year, she had a baby while being Prime Minister. We're going to start on the North Island. Again, north means closer to the equator. And so that stretch of land up at the top is very, very tropical. It's where you have a lot of bathing. It's also where you have most of the population. The total population of New Zealand is about 4.5 million. Of the 4.5, 3.5 live on the North Island. Only 1 million live on the South Island. There are beautiful undisturbed beaches on the North Island. But it's a nice place to live. You can be in your home and be out on the water within 10-15 minutes. Beautiful like area with islands to boat around, particularly on the weekends. North Island is also very agricultural. Like Australia, sheep and wool are major exports. And the central part of the North Island could be called a sheep's paradise. There are close to 50 million sheep in in New Zealand. And close to 16 million cattle. trout, New Zealand is the place to go. And for many years, a lot of anglers from the United States would fly down to New Zealand to do trout fishing. Trout are not native to New Zealand. They were brought there in the about 1860, 1870, and released into the various streams. The problem is there are no predators in New Zealand that go after the trout except for anglers. And I have been to streams that I swear you could almost step on fish and cross the stream. Deer, again, not something native to New Zealand. They were brought here by Americans. Today, deer are raised like cattle. You will see these very high fences, 50 to 75 foot high, to contain the deer. The deer are raised just like cattle, and then they're slaughtered and the meat is sent to Europe. Europeans love venison meat. We go all the way to the south part of the North Island, and it's the capital called Wellington. Again, a city that I have spent a lot of time in, both teaching and engaging in international meetings. If you look in the center, almost the lower right, you'll see a little round building. That is their Parliament building. I'm going to tell you a story about, I won't point out which building it is, but their intelligence services have a building here in Wellington that I found very unique. It's one of those larger building, multi-floor office buildings. The first 8 floors are made up of accountants and lawyers and whatever. But the 2 top floors are their intelligence services. And you go in and you get into an elevator, and the elevator only shows going up 8 floors. But if you have a pass and you swipe it on a reader, the elevator will take you to the top 2 floors. This is the Parliament building. Both of the statues or symbols that you see are Maori symbols. It goes again to say how important the Maori people are in the community of New Zealand. This is a beach that is just outside of town, and it's where some of my friends that I knew there in Wellington would go at Christmas for their Christmas picnic. It has a lot of European and particularly English flavor in town. Lots of flowers. They love their flowers just like Europeans. Little story here. As you know, I've done a lot of traveling over the years. And usually you wind up in a Sheraton or a Holiday Inn, and I don't care if you're in Frankfurt or you're in Sydney, the rooms are all the same. So on one trip that I was going down to Australia and New Zealand, I took Carol with me. And I asked my host, since we're going to be at a week-long meeting in Wellington, to see if they could find a bed and breakfast. Well, he sent out his secretary, and she found this very frou-frou bed and bed and breakfast. It was a delightful place because Carol could sit and talk with the owner during the day and have breakfast while I went off to meetings. And then she could tour the town. But I always remember this very frou-frou bedroom. I'm going to leave Wellington, but I wanted to point out that the New Zealanders are as much into sport as the Australians, and they're equally into football, i.e. soccer, and rugby. This is a stadium on the outside of town that is packed for games. We now go to the South Island, and there's a distinctive feature of the island, and that is it has got a core going down the center of very, very high mountains. Mountains that almost look like the Alps in Europe, and some wonderful alpine lakes. This picture will show you the difference between, we're looking on the east coast, we're looking westward and up into those snow-capped mountains. We start our visit in Christchurch. It is on the east coast, and if you'll remember a few years ago, particularly in 2016, there was a 7.8 earthquake that hit there. It destroyed a large part of the city. And particularly, it destroyed the cathedral to the left. That cathedral has been partially built, but there is a lot of argument both over aesthetics and funding of rebuilding it. So it still has fences around it today. The city of Christchurch has a wonderful little river called the Avon that meanders around most of the city. It's a delightful place to take a walk. But I put this picture in because they still have trolley cars. Great way. People use them. They don't drive their cars into work in downtown. They take the trolley. As I said, in some ways they're trying to take a mixture of it being like Venice with the gondolier moving you around, and then people in their personal watercraft moving around the river. But then it's, as the people across the river are doing, it's a lovely place to just sit and enjoy a peaceful afternoon. Just to the north of town, a little suburb sitting right along the coast, a wonderful little beach to go swimming or surfboarding. We head out from Christchurch, and we're going across what's called the Canterbury Plain, and we're headed towards the Southern Alps. This is the breadbasket of New Zealand. It processes more than 80% of New Zealand's grains and crops. And just as it looks, it's as flat as a billboard. But it's able to grow all those crops because of the snow and water coming down from the mountains that are fed into these various farms. There aren't any superhighways in New Zealand. This is the main road going west out of Christchurch. Again, you can see it's flat. And as you get towards the mountains, it becomes a little bit more arid land. And as such, you start to see the sheep. There's lots of sheep on the North Island, but there's just as many on the South Island. And this is what you have to go through when you go west. Gorgeous snow-capped peaks, and as I said, very pure water lakes. When you get to the opposite coast, the west coast of the South Island, it is extremely tropical because of all that moisture coming across the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean and hits those mountains. And much like the northwest part of the United States, it gets a lot of rain and therefore a lot of vegetation. Even on a clear day, it becomes misty. You can't see it, but going along there, there's a main road going north and south along these cliffs. As you go south, you continue to see those mountains. This is a picture taken in probably November timeframe. One of the things that the west coast of New Zealand has is two major glaciers. This is the Franz Josef Glacier, and Carol and I walked across those blocks. It doesn't look very far, but it's about 2.5 miles from where the bottom of this picture is to the face of the glacier. Walking a path for 2.5 miles is difficult enough. Walking across these boulders was a challenge. Like most glaciers in the world, they are melting. This one is to encompass much higher on either sides of the valley. While I didn't see it, I heard that this winter, which was their summer, the glacier was not white, it was black. If you'll remember this winter, our winter, their summer, Australia had numerous forest fires. So many that the sky turned black. And the soot came 2,500 miles across the ocean and deposited on the mountains and the glaciers and turned them black until rains came along and washed the soot away. You don't recognize her? That's my wife, Carol. She's wearing my hat, but she had it for the trip. This is at the start of our beginning of the walk. This is up next to the glacier. As we reflect on it, we start to think about this is a little danger because those chunks of ice were breaking off. And you can't see it, but over to the far left of the picture, there's water that streams out from underneath the glacier at a very high rate of speed. This is another glacier. As you can see, the glaciers are melting. They're melting because of global warming. We're now going further south. You can't go a straight line on the west coast. You have to do this zigzag back and forth around the various hills, or whatever you want to call them, and streams that come out. But it's beautiful, a beautiful drive. Got to remember, they drive on the left side, so keep to the left. Another area, just beautiful scenery. What it always used to amaze us, it's an area where you see very few people, hardly anybody on the beach. This is a beach that looks kind of messy, but it's one that I really liked. I thought about when I was there, boy, it'd be nice to build a little house back here to the left, clear some of this driftwood, and just live there the rest of my life. It's also an area where I went out and picked up lots of stones. Back up near where the glaciers are, it's an area where jade is mined. And when those glaciers go along, they scrape out jade. And it's deposited in that stream that flows from the glacier, goes out into the sea, and comes back here. Well, not all of them are pure jade. is a mixture of different type of rock and jade. I was finding all sorts of rocks with jade color in, and once again, if you come to my house, you will see them sitting on my desk just to the left of me. We now go back into the mountains. They do some engineering feats that are just marvelous of putting roads through those mountains. This is an area just south of an area called Queenstown, and it's called Milford Sound. It is a place of absolute beauty where a lot of the ships that go around New Zealand will come in to Milford Sound. It reminds me, if you've ever been to Norway and the fjords in Norway, it reminds me so much of the fjords. This is one of the ships. I put it in so that you can see how steep the mountains rise above this fjord. We leave this area and go back up towards Queenstown. Queenstown is again a place that I very much love. Remember, this is on the southern part of the South Island. So this is a year-round resort. Nice resort in the summer and fall, but in the winter, it's got gorgeous places of ski slopes. But it's almost also famous for the start of bungee jumping. Now I gotta tell you, I walked out on that bridge, stood up where you jump off, and I looked down and said, why would anybody in their right mind do it? But there are lots of people that do it. They tell me that nobody falls off, but if you'll notice, there's a little boat, yellow boat down at the right, in the center of the picture. That's for emergency in case somebody falls off into the river. Queenstown is a very large lake, and there is a coal steam-powered boat that goes across the lake and goes to a sheep farm. The sheep farm also has Angus cattle. And yes, that's dumb me sitting astride a bull. Why I did it, I'll never know. But it's a sheep farm. And they have hundreds of thousands of sheep and all sorts of dogs to do the herding of those sheep. I'm a New Yorker. I've never been around the shearing of sheep. And it was very interesting to me to watch that occur. And what I didn't know was when you touch that wool that's been shorn, it is greasy because of lanolin. We're back across the other side of the lake and we're going to a small little town. And you'll notice it said Autumn Festival. But if you notice the date, you might not be able to see it on the TV. It says their festival is the 4th through the 12th of April. April is fall for this part of the world. Now we're on something called the Jetover. There's a little stream that goes through the mountains and lots of sharp rocks, and this boat does between 80 to 90 miles an hour. It's a jet boat. It can do it in about 4 inches of water, and it zips through. This picture doesn't show it coming very close to the rocks, but sometimes you're just inches away from the rocks. Only crazy people would do this. And if you look at this picture, look at the second row back, On the right side, you'll see Carol, and next to Carol, myself. I said, only crazy people. We start to go back towards the east coast of the South Island. Some very, very pretty streams and rivers. Idyllic place. As you get closer to the coast, you start to see their vineyards. Lots of wines are made in New Zealand. We come up the east coast, heading back up to the north, and we're ending our trip. But I wanted to do so by having some of the Aborigines from Australia, some Australians on the left, and on the right, New Zealanders. They all say thank you, and we hope that you enjoyed your visit to Australia. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. I look forward to seeing you next week. Right now I have presentations that will last me up through the beginning of June, and I hope that you'll be able to join me for each one of those. Thank you, and as I say each week, stay safe. Keep your mask on when you walk, and be careful. See you next week.